Well, that's rather grim, but that's the reality that we're dealing with. So thank you, John, for illustrating that for us. Thank you to Politics in the Pub for having me. This is my first time at Politics in the Pub, and I've heard that it is a 30-year institution of Sydney, which is fantastic. So congratulations for holding the fort for that long. So I'd like to give you a little bit of background to ICAN and our work and the humanitarian initiative that led to the negotiation of the treaty that was adopted last year, and a little bit about our work in Australia and the challenges that we face with our current government and what we are going to do to change that and why we need your help. So I'm not sure what you know already, but ICAN generally is a global campaign coalition. It was started in Melbourne, actually, in 2007 as by just a small group of people who got together and decided that a new approach was necessary. They were activists and health professionals who got excited about a new idea that had been tried and tested for other weapons that are unacceptable, so landmines and cluster munitions and chemical and biological weapons. So they kicked off the idea, and that was in 2007, and for the first 10 years of ICAN, our work has been dedicated to getting a treaty to outlaw nuclear weapons. Is this sound okay? Is this, yeah, okay, all right. Great. So nowadays, ICAN is a fairly large beast. It's a flat structure campaign coalition made up of around 500 organisations around the world in 100 countries. So Australia knows the impact of nuclear weapons. I'm assuming that everyone will know about the British nuclear testing program that took place here in the 1950s and 60s. That program has left vast tracts of Aboriginal land permanently poisoned, and many people cannot go back to their land, and the intergenerational health impacts for Aboriginal people and also for the veterans, the workers on the test sites are devastating, and they're still unfolding today. So ban the bomb was not new when ICAN took it up. Obviously, we've built our work on the shoulders of everyone who's come before us. In fact, since 1945, that call has been resounding around the world. I imagine some people in this room might have been involved in nuclear disarmament efforts during the Cold War. Could you put your hand up if you have? Yep, that's good. Thank you for doing that work. So the whole world was rising up, as John was saying, against the nuclear threat during that time. And after the end of the Cold War, it seemed like we sort of forgot about the nuclear threat, even though there are still thousands that exist. There are still 15,000 nuclear weapons that are held between 9 countries. Many people actually now find it hard to imagine that a world without nuclear weapons is possible. These weapons have been normalised to a certain degree over the last 72 years. As a campaigner for nuclear disarmament, I'm constantly hearing this kind of language of, oh, good luck with that, you'll never get the nuclear weapon states to give up their weapons. But I think that perspective is actually pretty easy to adopt, and it's a bit lazy, because that it also has the effect of eroding our ability to imagine that we can change the status quo. If we can't picture it, if we can't imagine it, if we don't expect it or demand it, then of course we'll never get it. It's just not good enough to say this is a huge problem and that's how it is. We have to paint the pathway forward. So ICAN began because progress had stalled around 2005. Has everyone heard of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty? Yep, it's a very important treaty. It entered into force in 1970, so it's almost 50 years ago. It's been very important for stopping the horizontal proliferation of nuclear weapons. There were 5 countries when that treaty was entered into force. Now there are 9 that have nuclear weapons. There could be many more than that. Unfortunately, the treaty doesn't go far enough to force disarmament. It does contain a very important provision for disarmament, that's Article 6. It obliges all state parties to pursue nuclear disarmament, but it obviously hasn't been working, and it isn't watertight enough. So there was a legal gap that was realised in that the NPT does not actually prohibit nuclear weapons. And generally, as we've seen with other weapons, a prohibition treaty is very important to help pave the way for the elimination of the weapon. So the founders of ICAN were really inspired by the campaigns that banned landmines and cluster munitions especially. These campaigns focused on the humanitarian impacts of the weapons and brought the discourse onto what really matters, which is what the weapon does to people, to cities, to the environment, and also what are the testimonies of the people who've survived the weapons. So the Hibakusha from Japan, the people who've survived the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they've been very important to this process, as well as the people who've survived nuclear testing around the world, including from Australia. So in the cases with landmines and cluster munitions, the international community, civil society, governments got together and said, these weapons are unacceptable, we need to prohibit them. So the founders of ICAN wanted the same thing to happen for nuclear weapons. For too long, the nuclear weapon states have dominated the discourse around nuclear weapons. They say that they're necessary tools for security and create a dialogue that supports that kind of thinking. But if we step back a minute, we can see that they're weapons of mass murder, and they're effectively suicide bombs. As John painted very colourfully, any use of a nuclear weapon would be devastating. The Red Cross, the largest humanitarian organisation in the world, has come out and said, if there's a nuclear weapon detonation, there is nothing we can do to respond. We can't help you. So the majority of the world doesn't have nuclear weapons. They don't want nuclear weapons, and they feel threatened by the weapons that do still exist. And they've had enough of the status quo, because the effects of nuclear weapons detonations crosses borders. Radiation crosses borders. And we figured out that the nuclear weapon states are not actually going to be the leaders of meaningful progress in this area. They say that they support the idea of a world without nuclear weapons. They're very happy to give lip service to that, but at the same time, they're continuing to invest billions of dollars in maintaining their arsenals. So ICAN started working with supportive governments to hold conferences to explore and go into the brutal detail of the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons. And these were the first conferences on this topic that had ever taken place. So this is in 2013 and 14, and the first one was in Norway, and then Mexico, and then Austria. So they were hosted by those governments. So these conferences really helped bring the debate onto what matters, as I was saying before, and also brought out new evidence, including evidence around the risk of accidental nuclear detonations. So separately to the risk of nuclear war, there's also high possibilities that nuclear weapons can be detonated accidentally. There have been many, many examples over time where we've come close to that happening, very close. For example, a flock of geese or a weather balloon going up into the atmosphere and that triggering early warning systems on the other side of the world, or planes crashing with nuclear weapons on board, all of the safety mechanisms but one failing. So we've been lucky. These conferences helped generate a sense of collective rage and injustice, and brought together a critical mass of governments who decided to push a new agenda ahead to create new international law to prohibit nuclear weapons. So after these humanitarian conferences, there was a series of UN meetings, and that led to a resolution going forward at the United Nations General Assembly at the end of 2016. And this resolution was to propose that the UN begins negotiations on a treaty banning nuclear weapons. So the nuclear weapon states were very upset about this. The then US President Barack Obama actually called the President of Mexico, who was one of the sponsors of the resolution, and said, pull the resolution, don't let it go ahead. It went ahead and it won majority support, and we had a mandate confirmed to have negotiations take place last year over 4.5 weeks. So 2/3 of the UN member states participated in these negotiations. There was 1 week in March, and then in May a draft treaty was released, and then there was a further 3.5 weeks in June and July last year. So the nuclear weapon states and almost all of their allies boycotted the negotiating conference, including Australia.
Shame.
However, the beauty of this process was that we didn't need them to go ahead. In fact, we didn't expect them to be supportive from the outset. All states were invited to participate and welcome to participate, but it didn't depend on them. Also, the rules of the conference were that it would be open to everyone and blockable by none. So the nuclear weapon states knew that they wouldn't have a power of veto. They knew they would be outnumbered and that they wouldn't be able to control what happened in that room. We can draw an analogy with the tobacco industry. No one really expected that the big tobacco companies would lead the charge to ban the advertising of tobacco products. It was others that needed to create a new legal and social norm that would then apply to them from the outside. So in this situation, the nuclear weapon states, who often think of themselves as the most powerful countries in the world, were powerless to stop the global majority pushing ahead for the treaty. And the fact that this happened is significant and powerful in itself. 4.5 weeks later, the ban treaty was finished and adopted by 122 countries on the 7th of July last year. And this is it. This humble little document is a very powerful piece of new international law. So now this is a really good treaty. It's not perfect, of course, but it does what it needs to do. Article 1 sets out the core prohibitions. It says basically that no states can produce, test, possess, develop, stockpile, transfer, use or threaten to use nuclear weapons. It also says that you can't assist, induce or encourage a state or anyone to engage in any of the prohibited activities in the treaty. All states can join. Non-nuclear countries can join. Nuclear allies can join as long as they come into compliance with the treaty, which could mean removing any role for nuclear weapons in their security doctrines, in their foreign affairs policies and defence policies. Or it could also mean removing nuclear weapons from their soil. So there are currently 5 European countries that host US nuclear weapons. Nuclear armed states can also join the treaty and enter into a time-bound and verifiable agreement to complete the destruction of their stockpiles. So that's the join and destroy. They can also destroy and join. All of the state parties are bound to promote the treaty with the goal of universalisation. It has unlimited duration, so it lasts forever, and there are no reservations allowed. So that means that if a country wants to join, they can't just pick and choose the parts of it that they want to comply with. They have to accept the whole treaty and come into compliance with it. That's the ratification process. And it's also very clear in complementing other treaties. So some of the criticism we've had along the way from the nuclear weapon states is that we're trying to undermine the pre-existing nuclear disarmament framework, and in particular the NPT. It doesn't do that at all. It was specifically drafted to work together with the NPT and to actually help all states to comply with their obligations under Article 6 of the NPT. So how do we put this treaty to work? How do we create change with it? So the treaty will have economic, political, legal, and social effects. And it's a very important tool in the process to delegitimise nuclear deterrence in the security and legal spheres, and with the general public. So policies of nuclear deterrence are not consistent with this treaty. Delegitimising nuclear deterrence is very important for our work in Australia, and it's essential to the success of achieving the abolition of nuclear weapons, because essentially it means all of the states that currently prop up the nuclear weapon states removing their consent for their nuclear weapons programs. We're hoping that we'll see a range of effects of this treaty similar to the other prohibition treaties. So, for example, it's 20 years since the landmine treaty was adopted, and the market has shrunk significantly over that time. The last US cluster munitions producer stopped producing cluster munitions just last year or the year before. So over time we can see that the financial resources dry up. So for our work to expand the humanitarian discourse around nuclear weapons, and also to make this treaty happen along with governments, we were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize last year, which was, yeah. We often get more applause for that than the treaty, so really which is great. The real prize is the treaty, and the Nobel Peace Prize has been really amazing for drawing the world's attention to the treaty and to our work. And we actually didn't know that it was coming. We only found out five minutes before they announced it. So we're taking it as an indication to us that we're on the right track, and it's also hopefully an indication to the governments of the world that they need to pay attention to this treaty. It's also, I think, validated the struggle of everyone over the last 72 years who have been working for nuclear abolition, to tell us that what we are doing is effective and meaningful, even though there is still a long way to go. We know that we're up against a huge political institution, but what other choice do we have? We've got to chip away at this edifice. So the Australian government has not signed the nuclear weapon ban treaty, and it comes up with all sorts of reasons why. Our government's logic is rather circular. They support a nuclear weapons-free world once it has already happened. They support banning nuclear weapons once the weapons don't exist. But while ever nuclear weapons exist, then Australia needs them to deter other nuclear weapons. So it's just a dead end. It does not go anywhere, and it certainly is not complying with our disarmament obligations. And of course, it's an incitement to proliferation. If Australia says that nuclear weapons are essential for us, then what right do we have to tell North Korea that it shouldn't have a nuclear weapon program? So our government also says that now is not the right time to push for nuclear disarmament. The international security environment does not allow it, but the last time I checked, the international security environment demonstrates perfectly how risky it is to live in a world to the brink with nuclear weapons. Our government is a firm supporter of the disarmament initiatives that have not gone anywhere in the last 20 years. These initiatives protect the status quo and give the impression that the government cares and is doing something. So they have a whole list that they can rattle off in their press releases. But with this treaty, it cuts through all of that. Any country that genuinely supports nuclear disarmament and wants to make it happen will sign this treaty. And if it doesn't, then it is not. It is propping up and supporting the indefinite retention of these weapons in our world. The government also says that this treaty is symbolic and ineffectual. If it was symbolic, then our government would have signed it on day one. There would be no problem with that. They love symbolic gestures. The real reason, of course, is because our foreign affairs and defence policies claim that we need extended nuclear deterrence. And to change that would involve a somewhat awkward conversation with President Trump, which our government is currently not willing to have. But either way, the practicalities of us signing the treaty and removing nuclear weapons from our alliance relationship are fairly simple. The only barriers are political. And it's worth it. Extended nuclear deterrence is essentially the promise to inflict indiscriminate humanitarian harm and environmental devastation. We can't risk that. By our understanding, for Australia to join the treaty, it would need to remove extended nuclear deterrence from our policies and also ensure that the facilities at Pine Gap and other joint defence bases would not help facilitate nuclear war. So this is what we're campaigning for now. Australia should follow the lead of other countries in our region that maintain an alliance with the US, even a military alliance, without nuclear weapons being included in that bargain. So New Zealand, the Philippines and Thailand are all in this category. Of course, the role of the alliance is a bigger discussion, and there's many things to say about that. I won't go into that now, but I'm glad to see that there are many voices calling for more independence. But for the purposes of this treaty, the alliance can be maintained while excluding nuclear weapons. And this kind of shift would be really positive, really powerful, and it would help other nuclear allied states to do the same. I think John pointed out pretty well the risks, the ongoing current risks of nuclear war. We have seen in the last year and a half a greater willingness to use open hostile rhetoric threatening nuclear war, and this should be countered everywhere it pops up. But at the same time, if Trump is no longer the president, we can't then let it go, because we are still just as threatened by the 15,000 nuclear weapons that exist. On Saturday morning, our time, I'm sure many of you will know already that the Trump administration released a 100-page document setting out their plans for their nuclear arsenal, so the Nuclear Posture Review. It's in 100 pages, the word disarmament cannot be found, nor can Article 6, which is the disarmament article of the NPT. So the administration wants to make clear, this goes beyond Twitter, this is making clear a plan to increase the nuclear arsenal, develop more usable weapons, and to expand the situations that they can use nuclear weapons, even potentially for a non-nuclear retaliation. This will make it harder for other nuclear weapon states to make progress and to destroy their stockpiles as well. At least they're in a minority. The majority world knows that we can achieve better security and peace through disarmament actually happening. And that's the kind of security that is collective, not just a security for a few. So our region is really important and is really supportive of the Nuclear Ban Treaty. Australia is isolated among our neighbours. I think we're the only one in the South Pacific nuclear weapon-free zone that is not supportive of the ban treaty. So these are some of the countries that have already signed: Fiji, Indonesia, Kiribati, Laos, Malaysia, New Zealand, Palau, Philippines, Samoa, Thailand, Tuvalu, Vanuatu and Vietnam. And we're hoping that these countries can exert pressure on Australia externally to join the treaty. So some of the things that we're doing in Australia, our work from here, obviously is focused around getting the government to join the treaty. The current government has made it very clear that they're hostile to the treaty and they do not want to sign it. But we're working very hard on the Labor Party and we're seeing some good progress there. So the current platform, Labor platform, says that it supports the negotiation of a treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons. Obviously that's out of date now because the treaty exists, so we're pushing for that platform to be updated this year at Labor's National Conference in July to confirm support for the treaty and to commit a future Labor government to sign it as an urgent necessity. One of the tools we've been using to try to lock in Labor's support is this document. This is our Parliamentary Pledge. It's a global ICANN thing that any individual parliamentarian at any level of government can sign to say that you will work for your country to sign and ratify the Nuclear Weapon Ban Treaty. We have 2/3 of Labor have signed this. But there are more, so I'm going to read out a list of Labor New South Wales names who have not signed. I'm going to name and shame them and to ask for your help. They may yet sign, so we need to encourage them to sign. We need to take groups of school kids who have folded peace cranes, talk to the local paper, whatever it takes to get them to join their colleagues. These people are Chris Bowen, Jason Clare, Ed Husick, Deborah O'Neill, Michelle Rowland and Meryl Swanson. So all of the other New South Wales ALP members have signed the pledge.
Can you just read those again?
Yes, I will happily read them again. Chris Bowen, Jason Clare, Ed Husick, Deborah O'Neill, Michelle Rowland and Meryl Swanson. So they're all Labor. You can also go for anyone else. You're very welcome to lobby Liberal members. We have a couple from the coalition who have joined, but I think our time is more effectively spent on lobbying Labor. And it's part of the party's history. It's already part of the platform, so it should be a no-brainer for them. It's also an opportunity to distinguish themselves and to grab this movement because this is new international law. I think it's really inevitable that Australia signs on. It's just a matter of when. Do we have to hassle them for years, or can it happen quickly? Can it happen this year? So we've already fought and won against the nuclear weapon states. They tried tooth and nail. They fought tooth and nail to try to stop the ban treaty going ahead, but they couldn't. So we have this tool. It is very powerful, and we have to use it. We can put it to work. And even if our government hasn't yet signed the treaty, we should kick up a fuss anytime, anywhere that the terms of this treaty are contravened. So where there is a bank or some kind of financial institution that is financing nuclear weapons companies, whenever the policies, the foreign affairs and defence policies that speak about extended nuclear deterrence, whenever they are spoken, whenever they are reaffirmed, we should be kicking up a fuss about that. And around the world, there are so many opportunities to put this to work. I think right now it's our best chance to get rid of our worst weapon. It's the new international norm, and it's the way we have to go. So I hope you will help us with that. There are many ways to get involved. Lobbying those people I mentioned, and also helping to build the civil society demand. So, we know from our meetings with parliamentarians that they need to hear about this. They need it to be a broad cross-section of society that is knocking on their doors, that is making it impossible for them to ignore. So we need your help with that as well. Of course, also helping to fund our campaign, where we run entirely on donations, and it's a fairly precarious state. And we need to expand, we need to increase our work, and especially this year and next year. While the treaty is new, in the wake of the Nobel Peace Prize, we have a very unique moment to advocate. And also divestment, as I mentioned, with the financial institutions. There's a global report that's produced every year called Don't Bank on the Bomb. Most banks in Australia have holdings in nuclear weapons companies, and a few years ago we were trying to campaign for the Future Fund, so a government investment fund, to drop its shares in nuclear weapons companies, and they said, no, come back when nuclear weapons are outlawed. So I think it's time for us to go back to the Future Fund. Thanks for listening. I will leave it there, and hopefully we can have some discussion.
Thank you very much, Jem and John. That's a great talk.